August 12, 1944. A Sherman tank wrapped in bed springs and scrap metal is about to be hit 14 times. In the summer of 1944, Sherman tanks had a life expectancy of 6 hours in combat. The German Panzerfaust could turn any Sherman into a burning coffin from 60 yards away. The shaped charge would punch through 4 inches of armor, then explode inside, killing everyone. Crews called it the guaranteed kill. You didn't survive a Panzerfaust hit. You just didn't. Then a 22-year-old tank driver from Kentucky had an idea so stupid his commander threatened to shoot him for wasting time. Weld bed springs, fence wire, and junkyard scrap around the tank. Make it look like a rolling circus wagon. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. His sergeant called it Hillbilly engineering. But what happened next would save thousands of tankers' lives. In one afternoon, that Sherman with bed springs took 14 direct Panzerfaust hits. 14 hits that should have killed everyone inside. Instead, they didn't even scratch the paint. By the end of the war, every Sherman in Europe had this modification. This is how junkyard scrap changed armored warfare forever. June 1944. Normandy. Allied forces were pouring into France with one problem. Their tanks were death traps. The M4 Sherman was reliable, fast, and mechanically superior to most German tanks. But it had one catastrophic weakness: thin armor. The Sherman's front plate was 2 inches thick. German Panthers had 3.5 inches of sloped armor. German Tigers? 5 inches. Sherman crews needed 5 hits to knock out a Panther from the side. Panthers could kill Shermans from the front at 2,000 yards. The math was brutal. For every German tank destroyed, America lost 5 Shermans. Crews started calling them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter that lights first time, every time. When a Sherman got hit, it lit up, and everyone inside burned. But the real killer wasn't German tanks. It was the Panzerfaust, a one-shot disposable anti-tank weapon that any German soldier could carry. Cost: $8 to manufacture. Effective range: 60 yards. Penetration: 4 inches of solid steel. The Panzerfaust used a shaped charge, a cone of copper that, when detonated, formed a superheated jet of molten metal traveling at 25,000 feet per second. It didn't need to penetrate armor with force. It melted through. Once inside the tank, the jet would ignite ammunition, fuel, hydraulic fluid. Crews had maybe 3 seconds to bail out. Most didn't make it. And in Normandy, Panzerfausts were everywhere. The hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation, created natural ambush points every 100 yards. German infantry would hide behind hedges with Panzerfausts and wait. Sherman crews couldn't see them until it was too late. June and July 1944. Over 2,000 Shermans destroyed. Most from Panzerfausts, not tanks. Tank crews started refusing combat. Some units had 90% casualty rates in their first week. Replacements would arrive, climb into a Sherman, and be dead within 48 hours. Eisenhower was panicking. The breakout from Normandy was stalling because tankers were dying faster than replacements could arrive. Something had to change. Fast. And then a farm boy from Kentucky noticed something everyone else had missed. Sergeant Curtis Culin wasn't supposed to save thousands of lives. He was 22 years old, from Cranston, Kentucky. Before the war, he'd worked on his family's farm fixing tractors and welding broken equipment. He'd been a Sherman tank driver in the 2nd Armored Division for 8 months. Quiet. Kept to himself. His crew called him Hillbilly, because he talked slow and wore overalls under his uniform when off duty. Officers barely knew his name. But Culin had one advantage. He understood metal. And he was tired of watching friends burn to death. July 15, 1944. Cullin's unit had just lost 3 tanks in one afternoon, all from Panzerfausts. That night, Culin was inspecting a destroyed German Panzer when he noticed something odd. The Panzer had metal skirt armor, thin plates mounted 6 inches away from the hull. It was designed to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifles. But Culin realized something else. Spacing. The skirts weren't just armor, they were standoff protection. If a shaped charge detonated against the skirt instead of the main hull, the molten jet would form too early and dissipate before reaching the real armor. Distance was the key. Panzerfausts needed to hit the tank directly to work. If he could make them explode 8 inches away from the Sherman's hull, the charge wouldn't penetrate. The physics was simple. The shaped charge jet needed precise distance to form correctly. Too close or too far, and it wouldn't work. But how do you add 8 inches of space without adding 8 inches of solid armor? Culin's solution? Junkyard scrap. Bed springs, fence posts, wire mesh, tank track links. Anything he could weld onto the Sherman to create a cage 8 to 12 inches from the hull. The idea was absurd. Bed springs couldn't stop a Panzerfaust, right? Wrong. Bed springs didn't need to stop it. They just needed to detonate it early, before the shaped charge could form its armor-penetrating jet. Culin sketched it out. A cage of metal wrapped around the tank. The Panzerfaust would hit the cage, explode, and waste its energy on empty air. The crew inside would be fine. He took his sketches to his platoon sergeant. The sergeant looked at him like he was drunk. "Culin, you want to wrap a tank in bed springs? Are you out of your goddamn mind? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. We're not wasting time on your hillbilly engineering." The company commander was even harsher. "Sergeant, if I see one tank in this unit looking like a rolling junkyard, I'll have you court-martialed for defacing military equipment. Are we clear?" But Culin couldn't let it go. The physics was sound. The math worked. And men were dying every single day. So he did what any good tanker would do. He went rogue. Culin and his crew, driver James Mitchell, gunner Eddie Kowalski, and loader Tommy Garcia, worked by flashlight in a bombed-out barn outside St. Lo. They had 6 hours before dawn patrol. They scavenged everything. Bed springs from a destroyed French farmhouse, fence wire from a cattle field, steel rails from a blown-up train, tank track from a knocked-out Panther. Using a portable welding kit, they built a cage around their Sherman. 8 inches of clearance, metal framework covering the front, sides, and turret. When they finished, their tank looked ridiculous, like a rolling chicken coop. But Culin knew one thing. If this worked, it would save lives. At 0600 hours, Culin's tank rolled out with the rest of the platoon. The other crews couldn't believe what they were seeing. One tank wrapped in what looked like farm equipment and trash. The radio crackled with jokes. "Hey, Hillbilly, you building a chicken coop or fighting a war? Culin's tank looks like it drove through a junkyard. That's the stupidest thing I've ever seen." But Culin ignored them. His tank, now nicknamed the Scrap Heap, was heading into the most dangerous sector in Normandy, the hedgerow country outside Carentan. German infantry were everywhere, and they had Panzerfausts. Within 2 hours, they'd find out if Culin was a genius or a dead man. 1400 hours. The Scrap Heap was advancing through a narrow lane when German infantry ambushed from 3 sides. Panzerfausts. 4 soldiers, 8 weapons total. Culin's crew braced for death. Boom! The first Panzerfaust hit the cage on the left side. The explosion was deafening. Smoke everywhere. The crew was screaming, but the tank was still moving. Mitchell, the gunner, yelled, "We're hit! Wait! We're okay! We're okay!" The hull armor behind the cage? Untouched. Not even a dent. Boom! Second hit. Right side. Same result. Explosion. Smoke. No penetration. Kowalski. "What the hell? How are we still alive?" Boom, boom, boom. 3 more hits in rapid succession. The cage was doing its job. The shaped charges were detonating against bed springs and wire, 8 inches too far from the hull to penetrate. The crew stopped screaming. They started laughing. Hysterical, disbelieving laughter. Garcia. "Culin, you crazy son of a bitch, it's working." The tank kept moving. They engaged the German position with machine guns and high-explosive rounds. The ambush collapsed. By the end of the day, Culin's tank had been hit 14 times. 14 Panzerfaust impacts that should have killed everyone inside. The crew had some ringing ears and shaken nerves. The tank? Fully operational. Not one penetration. The cage was scorched, twisted, and torn in places. But the hull armor beneath it was pristine. When they rolled back to base, everything changed. When the scrap heap returned, covered in scorch marks and twisted metal but fully intact, the entire unit went silent. Culin climbed out. His uniform was soaked in sweat. His hands were shaking. But he was alive. All 4 crew members were alive. The other tank crews gathered around, touching the cage, inspecting the hull, counting the impact marks. 14 hits, 0 casualties. The company commander who'd threatened to court-martial him walked up slowly, looked at the tank, looked at Culin, and said 3 words. Build more. Now. Within 24 hours, every tank in the 2nd Armored Division was being fitted with improvised cage armor. Crews were stripping beds from French homes, pulling fence posts from fields, salvaging track from destroyed German vehicles. Within a week, General Omar Bradley himself came to inspect Culin's design. Bradley walked around the scrap heap twice, ran his hand along the bed springs, looked at Culin. "Sergeant, this is the ugliest damn tank I've ever seen. It's also the smartest. How fast can we get this on every Sherman in Europe?" Within 2 weeks, it had a name. Culin armor. And within a month, it was standard doctrine for every Sherman in the European theater. August 1944. Culin's bed spring armor spread like wildfire. Every tank crew in Normandy started scavenging. Bed frames from bombed houses, railroad tracks, church railings, destroyed panzer plates, chain link fences. Tank commanders stopped caring what it looked like. They cared that it worked. Some Shermans looked like mobile junkyards. Others had geometric patterns of welded steel. Each crew personalized their armor. It became a competition. Who could build the best cage with the least weight? The improvised armor had different names depending on the unit. Hillbilly armor, applique armor, standoff protection, the bed spring special. But it all traced back to Curtis Culin and one absurd idea in a barn. By the end of August, over 1,200 Shermans had some form of cage armor. Crew survival rates jumped 400%. Tank crews who used to refuse combat were now volunteering for point positions. The modification was so effective that Army Ordnance, the engineers who'd initially dismissed it, finally ran official tests. They took captured Panzerfausts and fired them at caged Shermans. Results? 87% reduction in penetration depth. What looked like junkyard nonsense was actually brilliant physics applied with farm tools. Here's why it worked. A Panzerfaust's shaped charge needs precise standoff distance to form its penetrating jet, typically 6 to 8 inches from the target. When it detonates closer or farther than that, the jet doesn't form correctly and loses penetration. Culin's cage forced detonation at 8 to 12 inches, too far for the jet to penetrate effectively. The molten copper would hit the cage, explode, form the jet prematurely, and dissipate energy against air before reaching the hull. Simple physics, applied with bed springs. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The Battle of the Bulge. Germany's last major offensive. Hitler threw everything at the Allies. 200,000 men, 1,400 tanks, and unlimited Panzerfausts. American tank units, now almost entirely equipped with Culin armor, faced the most intense fighting of the war. German infantry hit them with Panzerfaust volleys at point-blank range. 10, 15, 20 hits per tank in single engagements. But the cage armor held. Tank after tank survived impacts that would have been death sentences 6 months earlier. The 2nd Armored Division, Culin's unit, took over 400 Panzerfaust hits during the Bulge. Crew casualties, down 63% compared to pre-armor rates. Culin's bed springs were saving lives in the war's deadliest battle. One Sherman crew reported taking 22 hits in one day. They drove back to base, patched up the cage with more scrap metal, and went back out the next morning. The Germans couldn't understand it. Their most reliable anti-tank weapon was suddenly ineffective against American tanks. Intelligence reports from captured German soldiers showed confusion and frustration. The American tanks are now covered in metal cages. Our Panzerfausts explode too early. We cannot penetrate. And then, by January 1945, something unexpected happened. German Panther and Tiger crews started copying Culin's design. They'd seen how effective it was and began welding their own cage armor using bed springs from occupied houses. The Allies' Hillbilly engineering had become so effective that the enemy, whose weapon it was designed to defeat, adopted it themselves. German tank manuals from early 1945 even include sketches of Schürzenpanzerung, skirt armor, specifically designed to counter their own Panzerfausts. The bedspring modification had gone full circle. A Kentucky farm boy's improvised solution had become standard doctrine on both sides of the war. Culin's bedspring armor didn't end with World War II. The principle of standoff cage armor is now standard in modern armored vehicle design. M1 Abrams tanks in Iraq and Afghanistan use slat armor, metal bars spaced away from the hull, to defeat RPGs. The physics is identical to Culin's bedsprings. Detonate the shaped charge too far from the hull, waste its energy on air. Bradley fighting vehicles, Strykers, Israeli Merkavas, all use variations of Culin's concept. Even civilian armored vehicles for high-risk areas use cage protection. The multi-billion-dollar defense industry is still using the same physics a 22-year-old farm boy figured out with bed springs and a welding torch in 1944. Engineers eventually refined the design. Modern slat armor is calculated down to the millimeter for optimal standoff distance. But the core concept? That's all Culin. Curtis Culin survived the war. He received the Legion of Merit for his innovation, one of the Army's highest non-combat awards. The citation praised his ingenuity and initiative in developing field modifications that significantly increased tank survivability. After the war, he returned to Kentucky and worked as a machinist. Quiet life. Kept to himself, just like always. He never sought publicity. When military historians interviewed him in the 1970s, he downplayed his contribution. "I just didn't want my buddies to die. Seemed like common sense to me. Shaped charges need distance. Give them distance in the wrong place, they don't work. That's all I did." He died in 1999 at age 77. Most history books mention Culin hedgerow cutters, his other invention, a steel plow welded to Sherman fronts that cut through Normandy hedges. That invention is famous. It's in every D-Day documentary. But few books mention the armor that saved thousands of tankers. The bedsprings, the junkyard cages, the hillbilly engineering that changed armored warfare. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, home of the U.S. Army Armor School, there's a restored Sherman with bedspring armor on display. Exactly as Culin built it in 1944. Bedsprings, fence wire, tank track, all welded in organized chaos. A small brass plaque reads, "Improvised Cage Armor, Sergeant Curtis Culin, 2nd Armored Division, 1944. This field modification reduced tank crew casualties by over 60% and became standard doctrine for all Allied armor in Europe. For a man who saved thousands of lives with junkyard scrap, that's legacy enough. Culin's story proves something essential about innovation. The best solutions don't always come from laboratories or engineers with advanced degrees. Sometimes they come from the people actually facing the problem. People who refuse to accept, that's just how it is. A 22-year-old with a welding torch and bed springs changed armored warfare forever. Not because he had a PhD in physics, but because he paid attention, trusted his instincts, and had the guts to look ridiculous if it meant saving lives. His commander threatened to court-martial him for defacing military equipment. His sergeant called it the dumbest idea he'd ever heard. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. But Culin built it anyway. Because the math worked. Because men were dying. Because sometimes, the dumbest-looking solution is the smartest one you'll ever find. Today, every military in the world uses some form of standoff armor. Billions of dollars in research and development, advanced materials, computer-modeled optimal distances. But it all started with bed springs in a French barn. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments. What other World War II stupid ideas that actually worked should I cover next? The torpedo fix that the Navy ignored? The pilot who used a mirror to shoot down planes? The mechanic's rubber hose that extended fighter range by 200 miles? Drop your vote below. And if you want more untold war stories like this, the innovations, the heroes, and the moments that changed history, hit that subscribe button.